Good morning, good afternoon. I just got back from fall break, which means that I'm tired if you can't tell by the bags living under my eyes right now. I traveled across the country, got to visit with some family, which was nice, but that also meant I had a lot of travel time, which meant I had a lot of reading time. The two books that I read were both of Anne Bronte's books. So first I read The Tenant of Wildfeld Hall. I finished it on Wednesday, so halfway through my break, and then I picked up Agnes Grey by Anne Brontë, and I finished that actually this morning after I got back because I slept most of my flight back. But I read these two books over break, and all I can say is, why aren't we talking about Anne Brontë? Why aren't we talking about her? These books are amazing. I devoured The Tenant of Wildfeld Hall. Why don't we talk about her? You hear all about Wuthering Heights, you hear all about Jane Eyre, you hear about the other two Brontes, but my girl Anne gets no respect. She deserves respect. Her books are amazing. Oh, there are so many good things for me to talk about. Okay, so I'll talk about The Tenant of Wildfeld Hall first, because it was the first one I read. This is the second book that she published. It was published in, I think, 1848. Haha, I was right. It was published in 1848. It's her second book, and the story follows Gilbert Markham, who lives in a small town. He's a farmer, and a new tenant moves in to Wildfeld Hall, which is this old, abandoned hall just outside of the town, and this mysterious woman moves in with her young son, who's about 9 years old, and Gilbert is really interested, and rumors start to fly, and eventually Helen is the tenant's name. Helen Graham comes forward and basically gives Gilbert her diary, and that explains, where she's been. She's come into the country as a widow, but is she actually a widow? There are rumors going around the town that her husband's not actually dead yet. It's just such a compelling read. It is so interesting, especially when you get to the diary and you get to what Helen's doing and what her life has been, and just how things have happened to get her life to this point. It's really touching, and it's really real. I can't describe it any other way. Anne Brontë, a lot more than her sisters, is a realistic writer. She writes how things were. So this is a story of addiction, of love, of lost love, of adultery, of betrayal, of pessimism, and then of hope again. And it was amazing. I couldn't put it down as soon as I picked it up. You have to talk about the elephant in the room with Anne Brontë that everyone talks about in her writings, the very moralizing tone, which I see that, and there are a lot of religious undertones, and her idea of morality is very much based in religion, but I thought it was really interesting because that's how Anne rationalized the world, and you can see how she rationalized it. When you read Wuthering Heights, when you read Jane Eyre, there's a lot of fantasy, there's a lot of escapism. It's this really dramatic, gothic, you never know what's around the corner, you never know who's in the attic. But with Anne, it's very realistic, and you can see her using morality and religion to rationalize these bad things she sees in the world, and the bad things she sees close to her. With Branwell, her brother, who was an alcoholic, who died in her lifetime. You see her using it to try to understand what's happening, and she does it in the story. Helen, the main character Helen, she uses religion to understand what's happening in her marriage with her husband, and trying to help him using that, and it doesn't work. Well, I don't want to say it got in the way of reading it, but it was a lot more prevalent, I felt like, in the second half of the book, especially when things started going bad for Arthur, who is Helen's husband. But overall, an amazing book. I don't know why we don't talk about it more. I fell in love with the story. The characters are so realistic. They all have flaws, which meant I was really annoyed with them at some point, especially Gilbert. Oh my gosh, Gilbert could be so annoying. He could be so annoying. He's such a drama king. But yeah, a great book. I gave it 5 stars on Goodreads. I'll link my review down below. Amazing. And then the next book I read was actually Anne Bronte's first book. It was published in 1847, and it is Agnes Grey. Agnes Grey is a really short book. It was originally published as part of a 3-volume set with Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights. So Wuthering Heights was the first 2 volumes, and then Agnes Grey was the last volume. And this book is really sweet. I gave it 4 stars on Goodreads. It is the story of Agnes Grey, who comes from a poor background, and she contracts herself out as a governess to 2 families to try to make money for her family. She wants something to do. She wants to feel like an adult, be more independent. Her family, she's 18 in the start of the book, but she thinks her family still treats her as a child. There's a strong drive to prove herself, and so she goes to the Bloomfields first, who they have horrible kids. I mean, horrible. And she is their governess. She's trying to teach them, and it's really difficult. She feels both outcast by the family and by the servants. The governess is this weird in-between area, and then she, after less than a year later, she goes back home. She stays at home for a little while. She no longer works for the Bloomfields, and then she's sent out again to another family. She contracts herself out again as a governess. This time it's a family of 4. The 2 boys are sent off to school pretty soon, and so she's really looking after the 2 eldest daughters, Rosalie and Matilda. And it's the same thing. She feels ostracized by both the family and the servants. She's too high to be with the servants, too low to be with the family. And it's really a story about loneliness and having to make your way in the world, and it impressed a lot on me. There is romance in this one. There's romance in The Tenant of Wildfeld Hall too, but the romance in this one was just really sweet. So she marries a curate who's just an all-around great guy. He respects her, he gives her space, and that's something in both of Anne Bronte's works that I really like, that I really appreciate, is the woman saves herself. Before there's any kind of romance, the woman saves herself. So we see in The Tenant of Wildfeld Hall that Helen goes back, spoilers, skip this part if you haven't read The Tenant of Wildfeld Hall, but Helen goes back to her husband. She has left her husband because she is scared of the effect that he will have on her young son. He is an alcoholic. He has had multiple affairs. He is addicted. He is just not a good person. He verbally abuses her, but she goes back to him when she finds that he's sick, fulfilling a moral duty, which again is something very prevalent in Anne's works, is issues of morality, good and evil, right and wrong. She has a very good sense of morality, and she tries to put that into her books. So Helen goes back to Arthur, and you expect, in a book like this, you expect Gilbert to go riding in on a white horse and rescue her from Grassdale, where she's staying, where Arthur won't let her go again, or she feels she can't go, but Arthur is still being horrible to her, even though she is the only one there out of all of his friends and his mistresses. She is the only one there taking care of him, and he is still horrible to her until pretty much his dying breath. We think there may possibly have been a redemption, like right before he died, he was really terrified of dying, but we don't really know, and so it seems like up until the end, it was horrible. You expect Gilbert to come in and save her, but he waits. She tells him before, she's like, you have to wait 6 months before you write me. And he waits the 6 months, and then he sees what's happening. Arthur dies, and he just keeps waiting. And she saves herself, essentially. Well, she saves herself. She goes and takes care of him. She inherits a lot of money. She's independent. She doesn't need to get married. And even Gilbert says, he's just a farmer. Would she even marry him at this point? And she is taking care of everything. And then once everything's taken care of, then the romance happens. That's really powerful. That's something I haven't seen very much. Obviously, I love Jane Austen. I read Jane Austen a lot, but a lot of times the marriage is the fix for what's happening in the story. The woman doesn't fix it herself. And it's the same in Agnes Grey. Agnes Grey, eventually, after her father dies, she quits as a governess and goes back home to work with her mother to start a school in this new town that they've moved into. And the school's doing well. They have pupils, and they're thinking of expanding, and then Mr. Weston comes back. You know, it's after everything is resolved with her. once she's in a healthy state of mind, then the romance happens. And I think that is so cool. In books published in the 1840s, you still don't see that in books published today a lot. I feel like a lot of the relationships are just unhealthy. But these, like, there isn't any kind of overdependence on the other person. There's space. Gilbert gives Helen so much space. He, you know, waits 6 months to write her and then doesn't write her because he can't, and then Arthur dies, and he feels like it's better to give her time to grieve, even though he hates Arthur, even though he's like, I'm really not sad that he's dead. He still gives her time and gives her space to work out everything she needs to work out. And with Agnes too, Weston didn't go overboard. She wasn't even sure he liked her in the beginning. He was kind to her. He was one of the only people who was kind to her throughout the entire book, besides her family. And it's just a really positive relationship. And she says at the very end, because Agnes Grey is written as a recollection, Agnes is writing from the past, talking about how she got to where she was in life. And she says at the end that Mr. Weston isn't perfect, just like she's not perfect. Their marriage isn't perfect, they had hardships, but they worked through it together. And normally when you get to the end of a book, especially coming after reading Jane Austen, things like that, you're expecting a happy ending, obviously, but typically it ends with the marriage. You know, Lizzie Bennet and Mr. Darcy get married and they live happily ever after. But that part at the end just makes it so special because it's a happily ever after. Obviously, they love each other, but it also shows that people are human and there are hardships still, but that it's a healthy relationship, that they work on it together. And I think that is just fantastic. I don't know why people are sleeping on Anne Brontë. She's fantastic. I highly recommend these. I have reviews to both of them on Goodreads, and I will link both of them down below. So these are actually the second and the third Brontë books I have ever read. I read Wuthering Heights March of last year, and I really liked it, and I wanted to give them a try, and I found one of my new favorite authors. I love Anne Brontë's work so much. It's clear, it's well written, great stories, they're intriguing. And I think next I need to move on to Charlotte because I've never read Charlotte Brontë, and that seems like an oversight to me. Hope you guys are having a great week. I'm gonna try to adjust to the time zone. Whew, I'm tired. Gotta catch up on some work, but that's it.